let's talk about the strategic debate, because of course, to a certain extent, these ideas about strategy are new in our society. They have to also compete with, and they are rivals for the attention of our leaders. They're competing with ideas that came from older times. A lot of those scholars still exist. We later on we'll discuss them under the heading of realism. But Michael Dillon discusses a report called Joint Vision 2020, and he has some fun playing with the title of the report. He notices, for example, that not only is the report about how you would join together the various military forces in a more coherent operation, that's the joint part, but the vision for 2020 is not just a vision for the year 2020, but it's a playing on the word or the term 2020 vision, which is what we usually think of as perfect vision. So instead of sort of being a report that looks backwards in hindsight, it's a report that urges US military planners to look ahead to the future and to ask how they can develop 2020 vision about the future. And of course, future telling is a tricky maneuver, as we've said, because I mean there's a lot you can end up leaving out. But Michael Dillon isn't so much concerned about whether the report is accurate or whether the systems that it urges us to deploy will be accurate, but what it means to actually look forward in terms of security, look forward in time. The status quo, of course, is something that security planners and security operatives are always trying to keep in place. They don't like change. They don't like to be unable to predict change. But at the same time, in a network society that's very mobile, where we have free markets and global trade and entrepreneurialism, things are going to be changing. And so this is the problem with a network society. It's contradictory. Our security theorists and our security specialists want to lock down these networks, but they don't want to stop being a network society at the same time. So, and neither would we. We would hate that. We would hate if we suddenly found ourselves unable to buy cheap products from the third world. We would hate if we were unable to go on holidays in places outside of the country. This is what I think Dillon means when he says that the Global Vision 2020 articulates kind of an imperial vision, where it asserts a desire for kind of a global control of time and of space. That's interesting for us because, of course, it's not uncommon for us to imagine, or not difficult for us to imagine, that American policy planners in the past would have commonly put forward articulations about needing to control space. But controlling time, that seems a little bit unusual for us. But I think I might agree with Dillon on this, that if you want to sustain the status quo, then you have to get ahead of the curve in terms of change. And if you're going to be constantly ahead of the curve, by definition, then change is no surprise to you. Change is something you manage, actually, because you're adapting through the technological means you're deploying in the society and in the field of security, all the implements and devices you need in order to manage it all. So now, not saying that they could ever actually be successful with that. I think that that's possibly a little naive, and I think Dillon is suggesting as much, but that doesn't mean they're not going to try. Now, you don't have to be a left-wing sort of tree-hugging hippie in order to make that point, because in fact that's what the traditional securities theorists, what Dillon calls the so-called platform specialists, have been arguing now for a long time, because they feel that their voice has been marginalized by people like Donald Rumsfeld ever since the advent of this new way of thinking. And they would suggest that in fact America's security priorities ought still very much to be thought of in terms of old school looking military units and tanks and aircraft carriers and that kind of thing, that the whole cyber warfare thing might be a little bit exaggerated in terms of its ability to keep the country safe. Nevertheless, it's not just an American way of doing things. There's allies, of course, in Europe and other parts of the world who are engaging in readiness now for networked warfare and for cyber networked modalities of war. Then, of course, we can reflect on the fact that our enemies are also America's enemies are also preparing for this kind of warfare. In fact, if anything, 9/11, the attack on the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon were both very symbolic of a savvy sort of approach on the part of the terrorists to this new global reality. I mean, they took the nature of interdependency and its vulnerability and counter-functioned to turn it into a weapon. They used airliners, which are, of course, the great symbol of the global networks in some ways, to collide those airliners into the one of the greatest symbols of all of the globalization of finance, which was the World Trade Center, was really an immensely symbolic gesture. And of course they were able to get network television attention through their attack as well. So in three ways then we've seen there that the 9/11 attacks were very, very much networked. So why is this network idea or concept such a big deal? Well, I think in the one way it's because, as Dylan says, we got to think bees here. And what does he mean by that? Well, we didn't always have the technology to operate in networks, but now we do. And now that we can, people, I think, are exploring the benefits of having those technologies and understanding that those technologies bring potential advantages in terms of saving money. The costs of running an organization that doesn't have information technology are all to do with the hierarchy that it involves. You have to have the bottom level, you have to have lower level management, middle management, upper level, and then higher level. All of those things cost money. If you could flatten the form of an organization and make it self-organizing, put as little verticality in there as possible, then you have basically a swarm effect. And we know, of course, if we ever watch a documentary about how bees work, it's amazing, or ants even, it's amazing to think how these large colonies of tiny creatures can be so coordinated, almost like that they themselves together form an intelligent being. They seem to have a corporate personality of their own. And so when we think about the kind of intelligence, maybe one bee isn't very intelligent, but as a group or a swarm, they seem to be remarkably intelligent. So how does that work? And what does it tell us about the way we're organizing as a society today? I think many military planners idealize the idea of deploying units in the battlefield that are based on this swarm-like form. And that, in fact, was the entire basis of Rumsfeld's argument in 2003, prior to the invasion of Iraq, when he was talking about how America didn't need more soldiers, it needed smarter soldiers. And so, I don't think it worked very well. I think the invasion of Iraq was hugely undermanned, and I think it became an election issue, and I think it very nearly lost George Bush the election against John Kerry, which otherwise was, at the time, it was a popular war, right? So, but many people thought that it wasn't being fought very well. And of course that election, and subsequently the clash between McCain and Obama, was very much also a debate, not so much about the rights or wrongs of the war. I don't think either party was really debating that. Actually, if you look at the records, what they were debating was what was the right way to end it and get out of there. And people look back now at George Bush's mission accomplished declaration and sort of cringe a little bit, I think, because it seems so obvious now that America just wants to kind of get out of these countries and hasn't necessarily accomplished its goals at all. So what does this network form then mean for us if we are living ourselves in networks, and if society has to be securitized through this sort of highly sort of computerized, highly networked form of security? One of the things that we find discussed in Dylan is that because of the metaphor of the network, because of the metaphor of the genetic code, one of the things that we're constantly looking at is the potential for mutation in the data flow, right? So we are sort of hooked, if you will, on monitoring information, looking for variations in the information feed, looking and in that sense, we're constantly ready for war. We're constantly ready for engagement, and so readiness and sort of almost I want to use the word paranoia here, but maybe it's a little bit too powerful just yet. But there's certainly a sense that Big Brother is watching us, and there's certainly a sense that when we are, if you will, collectively in a society, that when we are the battle space, we are the molecules in the blood flow that the security forces are looking at to see if we're developing cancer. then really what security becomes about is modulating that data flow. And of course, there's huge stakes here, you know. So we will look for probabilities. We will look in the society. For example, one issue that becomes, if I'm not making my point here very well, I apologize, but where I'm trying to get to is this idea of that what's at stake here is perhaps looking at certain types or parts of the society as having greater probability to develop cancer than others, you know. So, for example, we see with the John Charles de Menezes case, but also I think in any, if we look at the you know, recent sort of racial shootings by vigilante warriors, we see in sort of Trayvon Martin case exactly this sort of question of racial profiling, of being paranoid of people looking a certain way, walking a certain way, talking a certain way. Jean-Charles de Menezes, Trayvon Martin, they were all just normal people going about their business. They weren't really doing anything wrong. Yet we, in our networked sort of paranoia, developed a sort of a sense of our own prerogative to see them eliminated or taken out. And that can, the question there, of course, you know, is that fair? Is it warranted? And is it even, at the end of the day, a solution? Because it doesn't really change the fact that the threats to our security stay out there, you know. So what kind of world do we live in now today then? What kind of world would you say we have inherited from this question of emergence of postmodern warfare, if we want to call it that? We're living in an age of network security, and we know about these various metaphors that are shaping the way we think about security and how different they are to the Cold War strategies that we used to have. Well, maybe we can say a little bit more about that by thinking about some of the people that shaped that Cold War thinking. Because realism really was the child of centuries, of course, of development, but one of the greatest exponents of it in the modern sense was Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian general who you can see in the poster here, in the picture here. Some people would go so far as to say he was the Isaac Newton of military strategy. Why? Because where Isaac Newton tried to develop in his scientific career universal truths, or what he called universal laws, to describe the way bodies work in science, in physics. So too, Clausewitz wanted to develop kind of a science of military strategy. And what he always said, Clausewitz, was that war is really the pursuit of politics by other means. What Clausewitz really wanted us to recognize was that politics was kind of the master of war, and war was subservient to politics. But one of the things that Michael Dillon is raising, and I think it's a very provocative question, is that if we are moving today from an era of Newtonian way of thinking about things to an information-based way of thinking about things, then we have to contend with the possibility that maybe Clausewitz is getting turned upside down. So what would it mean to turn Clausewitz upside down? Well, if his famous statement is that war is the continuation of politics by other means, then basically I think what that would mean is that he's saying that politics today is the continuation of war by other means. And so when Rumsfeld speaks about uncertainty as being at the core of today's security project, if uncertainty is what's guiding us, whereas in the Cold War we always knew that they were over there, today the enemy is us, it's among us, just the same way as cancer cells can be turned from good cells to bad cells almost overnight, then in a way we are entering into an age where security has to catch up with that paradigm, and so constantly has to be aware of information, constantly has to be preparing itself and being ready for battle. And this is why Dillon, of course, is using this play on words here, this idea of bodies information. What does it mean to say bodies information? Well, obviously bodies have to be put in formation, which is a way of organizing human life and creating order out of chaos. But also, if the bodies are themselves literally information, much the same way as our blood cells contain DNA, then in fact there's a double meaning here. And so the bodies that we are putting in formation are themselves informational in their nature. So it's a rather kind of a curious play on words, but it means we've entered into a post-Newtonian era, or a postmodern era, if you want to put it that way. And for some people, it's a very scary place. And I think that's what Dylan's kind of trying to suggest, that the stakes of this moment are actually quite great for us, and maybe we should be concerned. This is the last slide of this lecture. I just wanted to talk to you here about what we call critical security studies. There's 3 basic principles of critical security studies, and they come out of, critical security studies was born in the context of international relations theory realism. So it was not born in as a sort of a way of thinking about some of this revolution military affairs stuff that's taking over and slowly killing off realism. But on the other hand, I think it may have some useful things to say, and that's what Dylan wants to argue as well. So, where did this death of realism come from? It started, of course, we started moving into this post-Newtonian or post-Clausewitzian era at the end of the Cold War, because realism had not really anticipated that we would end up living in a global politics with only one superpower. They had anticipated that if the Soviet Union ever were to sort of lose power, then what would emerge in exchange for that power vacuum that would be left there in the absence of the Soviet Union would be a concatenation or a alliance or constellation, I meant to say, of other smaller powers that would balance out the power of the United States of America. And the fact that that hasn't happened sort of suggests that maybe there's a big problem in realism. Realism, after all, is the theory which suggests that international relations follows universal laws. And one of those laws, of course, is that power hates a vacuum, that there will always emerge in the absence of a balancing power for a great power, some sort of smaller balance of power, some sort of smaller constellation of powers will emerge to keep that larger power in check. So this is a sort of a universal truth, or an iron law, if you will, of international relations that realism offers us. But as I said before, critical security studies challenges this notion of realism and the way it saw the world as perhaps being kind of imperious in its own right, or imperialistic in its own right. In 3 ways, and Michael Dillon highlights what these 3 basic principles are in his writing. First of all, he says that from a critical security studies point of view, instead of the nation state or the actor that realism tends to typically see as sort of the primary actor on the world stage, critical security studies says that we have to think about the fact that subjects are fluid. So realists generally tend to pose a kind of a sort of a zero-sum game, and think about international relations in terms of zero-sum game, where the actors are all kind of basically and essentially rational, and that they know what they're doing. They will, and that's why they would have predicted, for example, that a balance of power would have emerged to keep the United States in check. That would have been the primary motivational force behind that. But instead, what critical security studies people put on the table is a history, a vibrant history of how those rational, self-interested identities are actually historically shaped and formed by different types of knowledge actually circulating in different eras. So, for example, what's considered to be a priority for nation states in the height of the Christendom era, for example, which we would know as the Middle Ages, is very, very different to what emerges in the sort of Napoleonic era, and is subsequently different again to what emerges today in the era of globalization. Those nation states all have different priorities and goals in terms of what they regard to be the good life as time has passed. And so this means that the subject is not just interested in survival, but is interested in survival as a certain type of life. And that type of life, of course, shapes and molds that understanding of what life is shapes and molds their security priorities. And we've seen this, of course, with our transitional metaphor from the Newtonian era to the biological DNA style metaphor that's common in the era of network warfare. So this implies a second point then, that there's not just one truth out there about security, there are multiple knowledges, and those multiple knowledges are always contending with each other, but usually and typically, as we know for a long time, realism was on top. Now it seems that another type of knowledge might be emerging as more powerful. So what does this tell us? We have a third principle or a third conclusion that we can draw from this, that knowledge is power and vice versa. Of course, Dylan is here citing Michel Foucault, and we've talked about Foucault quite a bit in this class already. But one of the things, of course, he's famous for saying is that there's no truth per se, but there's only truth-telling. Power is always there when we're talking about knowledge, and consequently, knowledge is always mediated by powerful pre-existing metaphors and ways of seeing, ways of measuring that shape and channel our knowledge in certain ways. And so what this means is that if I'm someone, say a realist, as we were just talking about, and my worldview, my ontology, to use the correct term there, but if my worldview is one of interstate rivalry, then I will imagine security in those terms. But conversely, if I see security as a question for a globally networked society, I will imagine security in those terms instead. So that's the power of these metaphors, right? It's not for nothing that we're talking about metaphors. Those metaphors are powerful. And so if we're talking about measuring knowledge about security in the world today, Foucault would ask us to think about the powerful metaphors and the powerful pre-existing formations and bodies of knowledge, the pre-existing assumptions about the world that shape and push our measurement, our selection, if you will, of problems in the world, because there's a lot of problems out there, but not all of them get on the table. Because in a way, I think not all of them fit with our metaphors, right? And so in a way, the metaphors are what's doing the work here, which is worrying, I think, for us, because we like to think, as Dylan says, we like to believe in that mirror image of how knowledge works, that all we have to do is hold up a mirror to society and it shows us back the truth. But actually our mirror is crafted and selected in a certain way that only certain things come to us through that mirror. So if you've ever been in a hall of mirrors, there's all kinds of distortions that mirrors can be put through. And I think that's what Foucault is trying to say, that our pre-existing knowledges are powerful, and the creation of knowledge today therefore is subject to these powerful negotiations and mediations that already exist in the past. Which is not to say, not even withstanding the idea that, as Dylan says, that there's also a lot of dissemblance or dissembling that goes on in contemporary politics, because, of course, sometimes telling lies is a way of carrying out war. Some warriors will deliberately tell lies in order to win, and if governing society today has become a form of warfare, then sadly you get ideas such as the ideas put forward by the neoconservatives, who were the philosophers that largely supported what the Bush administration was doing and gave advice to the Bush administration in prosecuting the war on terror. There is this sort of Platonic idea, or this idea that comes to us from Plato about the noble lie. And I think the idea there is that, societies, populations, even democratic populations can be instrumentalized by their war-making machines in the name of victory. And if it involves, and clearly, I think Michael Dillon says this very well. The reality is the administrations in Britain and in America went right up to the very margin of the truth in representing to the public the imminent danger that Saddam Hussein presented as a threat. And in fact, now that we know very clearly that there were no WMDs, it started to emerge from people like Valerie Plame's book and other sources that there was a lot of very strange dealings going on in and around the question of WMDs in the build-up to 2003's invasion. And Dylan definitely suggests that the Bush administration lied intentionally. If you look at the Downing Street memo, which got leaked as well from the British government, you see quite clearly that the British government believed also that the Bush administration was prepared to lie about WMDs in Iraq in order to put together its case to go into war. There's a lot. There's that you might say, well, that's a horrible reality, but nevertheless, it seems to me that what Dylan is concluding is that in a time, in a place where networked warfare is the name of the day, then social manipulation might actually be not all that unethical, for at least from the point of view of the war makers, because they believe that they have to achieve victory in this otherwise very, very difficult context where globalization is demanding of a certain type of response. I mean, what would Foucault say? We can talk about that. I mean, I think one of the things that Foucault would worry about would be that, as we said earlier on, there's a kind of a weird paranoia that can creep in knowledge making practices at a certain point in time, and maybe the question would be to back off. So that's all we have for today, folks. I will see you guys in class later this week. Okay, talk to you soon. Take care.